Howdy friends, it's Michael Parker and welcome back. In today's episode, we discuss an untold part of radio and world history that involved the great genius Nikola Tesla, his rival Guglielmo Marconi, and a mysterious wireless plant off the east coast of New York that may have played a role in the sinking of the Lusitania and World War I. Our guest is writer, producer, director Joseph Sikorski, and his latest film is Invisible Threads from Wireless to War. Joseph is an expert and historian on the work of Nikola Tesla, and this is his second film to pay homage to the great inventor. His previous film was Tower to the People, Tesla's Dream at Wardenclyffe. This is my second time to speak with Joseph about one of his films, and that's how we begin this interview. The last time I spoke with Joseph Sikorski was probably 2016, and at that point, he had this really great documentary, Tower to the People, Tesla's Dream at Wardenclyffe Continues. Well, Joseph is back with another great documentary, and I'm getting to talk to him all over again, so I take this as a good omen. Joseph, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Well, I'm glad to speak with you again. I've been watching the movie. Last night, I watched probably 70 to 80 minutes of it. I'm going to finish it tonight. And first of all, let me just say, man, aesthetically, it looks amazing. And you've got these old photos. We'll talk about the content of the film. We have plenty of time. But one of the things I love looking at your films is how you've animated these pictures of these people from the turn of the century. It looks amazing.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, we did put a lot of time into not only the AI part of the animation, but also just restoring the photographs to bring them to a 4K high resolution quality. So that was actually a big chunk of the time in the editing, was just preparing those photographs for processing. So it's part of the filmmaking process. You don't even really think about too much, but that was a very, very time consuming portion. And we used some third-party companies for the AI. We did some 3D rendering. We had to composite these elements into different programs, so it was a little bit complicated to make it all work. But we did want to try to bring the story to life, so it really makes me happy that you noticed that from watching the film.
Oh, you have to notice it. And the art direction was fantastic. I mean, when I watch a film, whether it's a documentary or whether it's a fiction film or whatever, I enjoy the visual aspect of a film, and I want it to deliver. and you do. And so, I mean, you got a great story, no question. This is like an epic documentary spy thriller, but on a visual level also, it's really pleasing to look at, and you've done a very good job on it.
Well, I really appreciate that, because there's so much information that we're putting into the film that, we want to make sure that we put the art into the film as well. And that's why we spent a lot of emphasis in the visuals.
Okay, so the film that we're talking about is Invisible Threads from Wireless to War. Your previous film, as I mentioned, was Tower to the People, Tesla's Dream at Wardenclyffe Continues. So in this film, we are continuing your celebration of the genius Nikola Tesla, but there's more to it than that. For the people that don't know, Nikola Tesla, great inventor, had created this thing called this Wardenclyffe Tower, which was this gigantic technological edifice, which unfortunately didn't end up being used to its potential. And in this movie, we're talking about building another edifice. So, Joseph, take a moment and just tell us a little bit about what this film is and where it took place, where this actually happened.
Okay, well, it's interesting because it happened within 60 miles of where Wardenclyffe was, in a town called Sayville. So the film really, it's an untold part of history. It includes competing giants of wireless technology. You mentioned Tesla, also Marconi, their secret codes, international espionage. There's even a love story in there. An amateur hero. There's a historic tragedy, and all these world-changing events. So, in the lead up to World War I, you had this competition going on between Tesla and Marconi, and this Telefunken. There's a new technology being developed, this wireless communications, and all of them were trying to create an efficient means of radio communication. And out of that, Telefunken was the one to emerge as the only one who could consistently reach Europe. So what starts as a technical triumph for Telefunken really very quickly begins to worry the US government, who suspects the radio station of secretly helping Germany in an unneutral way. And in fact, the station becomes the communications center of an international spy ring. And after war breaks out in Europe, the first thing Britain does is they sever the German transatlantic cable. So Telefunken becomes the only way for them to reach the West, which was vital for coordinating their ship positions and supplying their naval chains. So Telefunken takes on a world importance. And at this time, you have Tesla, who is actually helping Telefunken. And that's an interesting story as well. I don't know if you want me to go into all that.
We'll talk about Tesla at large. I think that it's fair to say that you're a big fan of Tesla. I'm a big fan of Tesla, enough that you would make these films. So the first one is clearly about Tesla. Tesla is a component of this film. I know that you've directed, produced, co-wrote this one. How did you get led to do this particular documentary? Is it just an outgrowth of your research into Tesla, or was there something else that compelled you to want to tell this story?
There were other compelling factors, but please don't feel bad about not knowing the story. No one knows the story. It's
Thank you.
It's really a story that almost died, and that was part of the reasons that compelled me to make it. There was a group called Long Island Radio Television Historical Society, and they formed to save the site of Telefunken, the Telefunken radio station building there, because they knew the history and the importance of this property, the historical significance. Unlike Tower to the People, where the Tesla Science Center was successfully able to save the property, the Long Island Radio Group was not able to. The building burned down before they could save the property. So I didn't want, and they didn't want, the history to go up in the ashes that the building did. So that was really the impetus to begin this process and get this story told while the experts are still alive. You know, a lot of people who are experts in this on the story, they passed during the making of the story. So it was important to get the story done and to try to get it done before we lose these valuable insights into what happened there.
When I hear Telefunken, I think of microphones, you know, and because big company, they ended up making a lot of different things. And so I didn't even know they had this radio tower. Another thing that I found fascinating was the Lusitania aspect of the story, because that is something that many people know about in the run up to World War I. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, that is a point where, you know, Wilson was trying very hard to stay neutral during the conflict. And right now Europe is at war. And this was a problem for Wilson because 128 American citizens were killed on Lusitania. So what happened was the Lusitania was, and now it's been proven, and we have the manifest, they were supplying arms to Britain and supplies to the British Navy. And that's why it was targeted by Germany. Telefunken had become this communications hub of this spy ring. And what would happen is on the pier, they had someone named Paul Koenig, who was, he worked for Hamburg America Line. And he had spies all throughout the New York piers, and they knew everything that was coming in on the ships, everything that was going out. They knew departure times, and they would send all that information to Sayville, and Sayville would send that to Neu in Germany. And what happened with the Lusitania is there was a very interesting investigation done by a New York Sun reporter named John Price Jones. He and Paul Merrick Hollister, I think in 1918, they completed the report. And what they had contended that the Lusitania was sunk as a result of a decoy message that was sent by Telefunken. So this was when I was researching Telefunken, and I came across this theory. I said, wow, that's really, really interesting. So I started looking into, how they came to this theory. And whether or not events transpired this way, I can't tell. But it was a very interesting theory. And we included it in the film because one of the reasons it was discounted was because, let me tell you the theory first. So you had Captain Karl Boyed. He was the German head of the German Admiralty. And he was using Telefunken frequently to transmit messages, usually coded messages right under the nose of American censors who were there. But they had broken the British code. Brits didn't know that the German Admiralty had broken the code. And according to Jones, the way things transpired was, Germany wanted to sink the Lusitania because they knew it was smuggling arms. So they had spies that would go aboard some of these ships that they targeted. And there were two spies that surveyed the journey of Lusitania, and they noticed a pattern. What would happen is Lusitania was not afraid of being sunk on the journey over because of its really immense speed. It had a speed that the U-boats just wouldn't be able to keep up with it. But where they were vulnerable was when they stopped off the coast of Ireland. That they would stop and they would wait for coordinates to be radioed by the British Admiralty to tell them where they would meet up with a convoy that would escort them into port. So they used that pattern, again, according to Jones, against them. So according to Jones, on this day, May 7th, while waiting for the message to come for the British Admiralty, before the British Admiralty could send the coordinates, he alleges that Telefunken sent the coordinates of where the Lusitania should go, and basically led them right to the U-boats that sank them. And it's an interesting theory because there's been a lot of controversy over the inquest and Captain Turner, who was the captain of Lusitania. There's a lot of hostility towards him because he had claimed he had received a set of orders telling him exactly where to go, 10 miles south of Old Head of Kinsale, which was off the Irish coast. And the British Admiralty denied sending those orders. And Turner actually produced the orders at the inquest. It produced a copy of the orders. So, this theory would kind of fill that hole in if that were true. So, it was just very interesting. And they detailed that from Telefunken, they used what they call an English fist, which is a way of using the telegraph. See, English operators and German operators, they had a little different touch on the key of the telegraph. So you could tell if it was someone German sending the message or if it was someone British sending the message. And supposedly on this day, they tried to disguise this subterfuge by using a British fist on the telegraph. So just an interesting theory. Whether or not that's how things transpired, we don't know. I would like to investigate it more, but we included it because one of the reasons that they used to discount it was that it was technically impossible. The Lusitania would not be able to reach Lusitania for a number of different reasons. One being the distance and the equipment that they had at Telefunken. The other reason being having to do with the compatibility of Marconi systems and the Telefunken system. But during our research, we found two incidents where Telefunken actually reached the Lusitania and communicated with the Lusitania. So we thought it would be interesting to include all that. And at the very least, it shows you the prominence that Telefunken had achieved in the field of wireless, that it would be a part of a theory that possibly plausible theory that could have led to the sinking of the Lusitania.
Joseph, I think it's more than plausible. I think it's reasonable. And yes, you point out that they were able to communicate with Lusitania, and ships at sea from the Telefunken towers. So you would think in wartime, you are going to exploit every possible advantage that you may have. And so, yeah, I think it's plausible and reasonable. So I think it was definitely worth putting in the film.
Oh, I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and again, it was all around this, this topic that people don't know much about. So
No.
it really helped bring it into context to show this information.
Talk a little bit about the issues between Nikola Tesla and Marconi, because for the people that don't know about all this, give us like a little quick history lesson on who really invented, or how can I phrase this? Marconi is famous for it. Nikola Tesla may have invented it. Explain to people who don't know about this what the deal is between these two gentlemen.
Well, it's interesting because Telefunken actually was the start of this whole legal battle, because Marconi sued Telefunken because he felt they were infringing on his electrical patents. And I don't know how far in the weeds you want me to get with this, but Avalage had a patent for electrical telegraphy from 1898, and that was transferred to Marconi's company. And Marconi had a 1904 patent in wireless telegraphy, which was really an amended version of an earlier patent from 1900. And Telefunken was using patents from someone named Richard Fund for what they called a quenched spark gap transmitter. And Marconi thought this was infringing on his patents. So that was the first part of the war. And what happened is Telefunken hired Tesla to not only be sort of a guide in the creation and of their plant, but also they wanted Tesla to go on the stand and defend Telefunken, because Telefunken was aware that Marconi's claims were invalid by Tesla's claims.
Mm-hmm.
And you ended up having Tesla suing Marconi after that. So they were all suing each other. Marconi was suing Telefunken, Tesla was suing Marconi. And what ended up happening is Marconi rarely got involved with patent suits because there were patent suits all over the world. But this was something, Telefunken was such an impressive organization and really could stop Marconi's domination of communication, that Marconi's people said, you better go in person to this trial in America, because this is something that could do some damage. So Marconi actually came over on the Lusitania, which was basically the last voyage of the Lusitania before the voyage it was sank. He came over on May 2nd, I believe. It was sunk on May 7th. And he appeared in court, and people like Ferdinand Braun and all these luminaries of radio were in this courtroom trying to decide who was right. And quite literally in the courtroom during the trial, Italy entered the war. And Marconi, who was he was Italian, though his company was British, he was called back to Italy and to serve. And the judge ended up dropping the case until Marconi would come back after the war. But that case would never, ever continue, which was good news for Telefunken, because while the case was in limbo, they were able to freely use their wireless without fears of being shut down. And where the battle comes later, when Marconi sues the U.S. government. And part of this was over the fact that the U.S. government was using Telefunken equipment in their Navy, which is really another interesting aspect of this film, because they tested all these different systems and they found the Telefunken system to be the best. And during this time, when they're trying to keep neutral, you have this specter of, if they go to war with Germany, they're going to lose all of their communications capability because they're kind of entwined into the German technology. So that's another interesting aspect of it. But back to your original question. So Marconi sues the U.S. government, and this case goes on and on and on. And actually, it's not resolved until, well, both of them are dead. Marconi is dead and Tesla is dead. And I think it's very important to sort of, and I really wanted to, because there are a lot of misconceptions of, who invented what. Marconi's suit against the government. He was claiming infringement of 4 of his patents that were enhancement to wireless. And the Supreme Court's task was to determine if Marconi's patents were valid or if they were anticipated by prior art. And part of that prior art was from Nikola Tesla. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt was actually Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he had found a letter to Tesla way back where, and this is in Mark Cypher's new book, Tesla, Wizard at War, which I recommend. And he discovered this letter from Tesla. There was a series of communications in the early development of radio, and FDR found this information and said, we can use this in the case against Marconi. But basically, what ended up happening was the court ruled that the U.S. did not violate Marconi's patents because they had been based upon an aspect of communications that had been anticipated by Nikola Tesla. So the court had rejected Marconi's argument that Tesla's only purpose has been to transmit electrical energy. They were reasoning that electrical waves by any wireless system are really just one form of electrical energy. So the suit was dismissed on that point, and Tesla was given credit for that part of the radio patent. But there are really some important takeaways that are frequently missed. And that is that the court did recognize that Marconi was the first to utilize wireless for communications. So that's a very important thing to note. And it's also important to note that the court also ruled that there were aspects to the radio patents that were not anticipated by Tesla or Marconi. There were parts that were anticipated by John Stone and Sir Oliver Lodge. So really you had this, you had all of these people contributing to the evolution of radio. So Tesla's patents were violated in the cause of this evolution. And there was another aspect to Tesla. His Tesla coil was actually part of the equipment that Marconi was using to make his oscillations. So Tesla thought his equipment was being pirated outright because they were using the Tesla coil in the system. So yes, Tesla was vindicated. Sadly, he did not live to see that vindication. But yeah, the dissenting opinion and actually the majority opinion did recognize Marconi's contribution as well. And also importantly, John Stone and Sir Oliver Lodge.
And in the lead up to Tesla working with Telefunken, he was held in admiration by many of the German scientists of the day because they knew some of this. So when he was brought on board, they applauded that. He made immediate recommendations to them for the Seville Tower to extend the ground. I mean, he immediately got in there, gave them advice. Of course, it worked. And how much did they pay him for that? For his assistance at the time?
He was getting a fee of, I believe the figure was like $1,500 a month, which was quite a lot of money in that at that time. And and part of it was for consulting, and part of it was for his patents. I mean, the German scientists, they were friends with Tesla, and they kind of felt bad because Tesla had basically invented this, and he wasn't getting really any money out of it. So he had quite a bit of money, which he hoped he would use to resurrect Wardenclyffe, which was in financial despair at the time. Tesla, it was really a very sad position for Tesla to be in because as we started getting into the war, Tesla was his parents were Serbian. He was born in Croatia. So World War I began by the death of Archduke Ferdinand by a Serbian. So he had this delicate balance to walk with his German business associates. But then as we started getting into the war, he was also friends with someone named Sylvester Virak, who ran a newspaper called The Fatherland. And The Fatherland was basically paid propaganda by the German government. And Tesla's association with him really put him on the outs with, his American colleagues. So Tesla was really stuck. He was depending on this business relationship to save Wardenclyffe, but he was being pulled in all these different directions, all these political directions, and he was just a scientist who wanted to help the world evolve
Mm-hmm.
from a technical point of view. So it was really a dark time.
There was another gentleman, the man who was the primary mover and shaker on the building of the Savile Tower, this Ludwig Boderman, a brilliant man, not to the level of Tesla, but still, a hardworking guy. He didn't want to be involved with politics either. And it's interesting that these men of great intellect and great work ethic, they didn't want to be involved with the politics of these things, and these types of projects and these types of advances wouldn't have happened without them, and they wanted nothing to do with the political aspect of it.
Exactly. And Ludwig Baderman not only was responsible for making Telefunken run efficiently, but he had some patents of his own right. In his own right, he had developed a patent to do with coaxial cable, one aspect of coaxial cable that he had done. And believe it or not, when President Calvin Coolidge gave his first radio address, it was a historic night. And that microphone he was using was hand-built by Ludwig Baderman. So he was also a genius and a very important figure. And what happened to him also was he felt the anti-German backlash that happened in America. And that was a very dark part of the story. Because after the sinking of Lusitania and after we were starting to get into the war, there really was a terrible backlash against German Americans. And, some of the things that happened, it started with, some silly things like trying to erase any semblance of German culture. For example, like a hamburger became Liberty Steak, and they were changing names like Berlin, Michigan, became Marnie, Michigan. But it really grew in severity as the war progressed. German Americans felt intimidation from their communities, persecution from the government. And the Department of Justice created a list of almost 500,000 German Americans, and over 4,000 of them were interred, mostly at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia. And the government extorted them to buy war bonds to prove their loyalty. They were banned from joining, organizations like the Red Cross. There was just widespread harassment from the government, careers ruined, property vandalized, and there was even violence from the people in the community. Yeah. In fact, there was a farmer named John Meintz who was abducted for failing to support a war bond drive, and he was whipped, he was tarred and feathered, and he was threatened with murder if he returned to the state. But the worst was Robert Prager. Robert Prager had a really thick German accent, and he spoke of socialism, and that was frowned upon. He was grabbed by a mob. He was accused of being a spy. He was stripped naked. He was paraded down the street in an American flag until they reached a hanging tree, and they lynched him. 11 men were charged with the murder, and they were all acquitted. And this was the environment that was happening to German Americans. And, most of the German Americans were loyal Americans. So it was a very, very dark time in America. And it was a dark time for Ludwig Baderman because he felt that personally. In fact, he was harassed as well from the government. He, after Lusitania, he had decided he wanted nothing to do with the German government. He wanted to become an American citizen, and he was trying to become one. He filed, and during this period, his application was mysteriously lost, and he was also harassed by Secret Service. They would come to his house. He was living with his mother-in-law and their family. Dean Baderman, who is the great-grandson of Ludwig Baderman, tells a story how the mother-in-law of Ludwig physically pushed the Secret Service out with a broomstick at one point because they would show up unannounced and just start going through the house trying to find anything. I want to point out he was completely exonerated by the time the war was over.
So what they built in Savile, New York, was this really, really large radio tower, because we mentioned Wardenclyffe of Tesla's, which was 60 miles away. But what they built in Savile, New York, was this really, really large tower. Some land was bought under the guise that it was going to be used for a German chocolate factory. And in fact, what ended up happening was they built this large radio facility, and this is where Ludwig Batterman worked, and this is where these signals were being sent from that we're talking about in regards to reaching Germany and reaching the Lusitania. Joseph, how many people in Sayville, New York, know the history of what happened in their area these days? Is it widely known? Is it not widely known?
Believe it or not, it's still not widely known. And that was a frustrating part of Long Island Radio and Television Society. They were trying to save, this is very similar, it kind of mirrors what happened with trying to save the Wardenclyffe property with the Tesla Science Center. The people in the community, in both cases, did not understand the historical significance of the property, so they didn't see the value in saving.
That land that the tower is on, don't tell me it's got condominiums on it or something. What's being done with it now?
I think there's a soccer field on a portion of it. There's a solar farm on a portion of it. One thing that is still there, though, are those giant cement anchors that were used to stabilize the 500-foot tower. Those are still there, and I can't imagine those ever going anywhere because of the immense size and weight of them. It'd be a real task to try to get them out.
What Joseph is describing, when you watch the film, you'll see they build this tower that looks, enough like a conventional radio tower that you'll know what it is. So it's then straightened by the cables that you'll see around radio towers. But in this particular case, because of the height of the tower, and that's just how they did it back then, they have these two sets of buildings, one set at a particular, I think, 200 feet away, and then there's another one behind it. In both cases, they're big anchoring buildings. Talk about just the tower itself, because you guys there was a unique ball joint at the bottom of this tower, and it was really at the time quite the engineering feat.
Yeah, well, it was to see a picture of it, it was quite kind of amazing, because the bottom of the tower, it's sort of shaped like a pyramid. So all the points come down to this pyramid, and the tower would appear to be sort of floating in the air because it would come down to this one little point onto this ball joint. And what it allowed was the height of the tower to be able to move in the wind, so it could withstand that kind of force, but also that it could be lowered to the ground and raised up again if it needed to be worked on or repaired.
And eventually they added additional towers around it to create that umbrella type effect.
They call that a capacitive top hat, where they basically compensate for the lack of height for the tower. Not that 500 feet is small by any means. Tesla's tower was 187 feet. So this is a 500-foot tower, but by spreading it out along the top and having these wires connecting these other towers, you were able to achieve a greater distance as if you had a much taller tower. So it's very interesting. So in some ways, the tower itself was basically a pole that was suspending the umbrella antenna. When you look at the tower and you think the tower is the responsible part for the transmission and the receiving, it was holding up a lot of these wires that were doing the job.
So these two towers, Wardenclyffe of Tesla, Telefunken's Sayville Tower, when they were finally disassembled or brought down, what time period did that happen for the two towers?
Well, Tesla's tower came down as part of this story in
I haven't gotten to the end yet.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't tell you, but but it is connected, and there is a connection to Telefunken that you will see. With Tesla's tower coming down, and believe it or not, the Telefunken tower was. You'll get to the point. The Navy and the Marines will raid the site as we enter the war. And then they will take over the tower, and they will turn it into a Navy radio station, and they will use the tower. The interesting thing is they have to bring in their own equipment because they didn't know how to work the sophisticated German equipment. So they had to bring their own in, but they still use the tower itself.
Well, that makes sense, because it was really functional, state-of-the-art tower, so it would make sense that to keep it erect. But when did that finally go away? Because it's clearly not there now. People don't even know that this thing happened. So when did that tower finally get removed or disassembled?
I believe that happened sometime in the 60s.
Was it in use up until that time?
It was. In fact, it was transferred eventually to the FAA, and they used it there. And that's a sad part of the story. The FAA was ready to give the property to the Long Island Radio Historical Society, and before they could take possession of it is when the building burned down. So draw your own conclusions. I would like to, if we have a few minutes, talk about another hero who is in the film. And this is one of the most fascinating aspects. He's a person named Charles E. Apgar. And what was happening was we had Navy sensors on the site that suspected that there were nefarious messages being sent back and forth, but they couldn't prove it. So they kept sending more Navy sensors, and they had people on Fire Island and other locations go dark so they can listen in to what was being sent back and forth. And at the time, there were a lot of ham radio enthusiasts. They were kind of like, citizen journalists in a way. They would listen to everything, and they were kind of like a civilian watch of the airwaves.
Yes.
And they would hear all this. And there was something very significant they heard. They heard a weird buzz coming from Sayville to Neuenn, Germany. And these transmissions were always late at night. So the Navy wanted to figure out what was going on, but they couldn't. But there was an amateur radio operator named Charles Apgar in New Jersey. That's why I'm glad we're having a screening in New Jersey.
Yes.
He had built a sophisticated radio receiving station at his house. And he used the trees in his backyard to create this giant antenna. But what he could do that the United States government couldn't do is he figured out a way to record wireless radio. Charles E. Apgar was the first person to record wireless radio. And he would record these signals. He figured out a way to boost the signal and transfer it to an Edison dictaphone onto wax cylinders. So at night, he would record all this information going back and forth, and he would get these buzz. And according to legend, one time he just thought he got a buzz and didn't get anything, and the dictaphones had to be wound to speed. Well, one time when the dictaphone was winding down, the signal slowed down, and you heard the sound of Morse code. And Charles Apgar ended up breaking how the Germans were sending the code under the noses of the sensors. Telefunking was speeding up the messages. So a regular Morse code just sounded like a blip, and they were sending it out at the fast speed. Germany was getting it and slowing it down, and that's how they were getting the messages. So this amateur radio operator was the person that really exposed this whole plot. And the U.S. government had no way of doing this at the time. And the person in charge there were two people in charge: William J. Flynn, who was a Secret Service, head of the Secret Service, and the person in charge of radio was a man named William Crum. And Charles Apgar had reached out to them. William Flynn asked Charles Apgar to record everything coming out of there. He gave him money to purchase wax cylinders. And Charles Apgar, from 11 o'clock at night, would record these things. Then he would transcribe them until 3, sometimes 4 in the morning. He would drop off the discs and then go back to work his regular day. So this is an American hero who I think deserves some recognition. I would really like him to get like the Presidential Medal of Honor or something for the way he really, the sacrifice he made in exposing this.
We'd like to thank Joseph Sikorski for coming on the show. And if you wish to know more about Invisible Threads, go to his website, invisibleThreadsFilm.com. And if you are on Twitter or X, look for them as @TeslaFilm. If you're a Tesla buff, a history buff, a radio buff, or just a curious person, you should seek this film out. You will be well rewarded. Thank you to everyone who's been listening to the show and sharing it with their family or their friends. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. You do not have to smash the subscribe button. A simple click will do. And while you're at it, give us a like. This all bumps the algorithm and helps me publicize and spread news about the show. I have lots of spooky content coming up in the next few weeks leading up to Halloween. So if that's your jam, you're not going to want to miss the next 5 or 6 episodes. I'm digging deep into my cryptic archives for some of these, and some of them will be brand new. So friends, just keep listening, keep sharing, and until next time, keep your heart and your mind open. Peace.